Well, hello. This is the a recording of the research skills session. It seems that the first video, the sound was not extraordinary, so thank you very much to my colleague Iman for reminding me to do the recording again and make sure that the sound is better now. So let's discuss a little bit about the research skills, one of the crucial skills in all curriculums, isn't it? And how can we have the students developing the ability to find an answer to a question or to a problem by doing a purposeful and meaningful research and making sure that we avoid the typical academic misconduct. So the first thing that I would like to insist is the fact that researching is not only gathering information, and this is something that many students believe, that researching is going and Google something and trying to find specific answers to a specific question. The most complex aspect of the researching, it's probably the ability to give and to make sense of the information and to know what is relevant, what is not. Is it biased? Is it something that we can trust? Who wrote that source? What's the point of writing it? Why are we using this source? And the more we move into higher levels in the MYP programs, in the GCSE programs, we see that the expectations in terms of research are getting higher. So let's try to see what systems, what strategies do we have to make sure that when the students research, they are able to make sense on the information and they're able to reflect on the information they find. Looking at the research process, I think I propose those steps going from the absolute beginning of the process, which is accessing the information. How are we going to find that information? Do we understand this information? Can we put that information into our own words in order to show understanding? And then the next step would be, how do we organize the information that we just gathered? What's the best way for us to do it so we can really understand quickly what we read? Some students will do mind maps, some students will do bullet points, some students will use any other process of way of showing understanding. It depends on the student, depending on their visual, either kinesthetic, either prefer to record their voice, but the organization of the ideas is important. Then we're going to compare. We're going to compare the information we have with other sources of information. And we're going to try to see if we need to look for more sources so we can have a balanced view of the problem. Then we're going to evaluate the sources. How? Maybe you want to compare and contrast. Maybe you want to look at the origin, at the purpose, at the value, the limitations of the sources, the range of sources, written, visual, audio, newspaper, magazines, internet. And then we're going to analyze. We're going to break down that information that we have, and we're going to break it down into what we consider essential. Essential so we can answer the question that has been given to us. And then we're going to infer. We're going to make deductions, look for points of view, look for bias, look for interpretations. And finally, we're going to conclude. And in the conclusion, we're going to take a decision. We're going to look at the implications. And we might even take a position. So this is the research process from my point of view. This is at least the research process that students are invited to follow in the diploma program, for example. Now, we just need to understand as well that not all information is good information. Then we need to probably look at, as an example, the theories of Noam Chomsky about media and the way in which media manipulates. So how can we make sure that the information that we collect is quality information? How can we evaluate those sources? How can we consider sources being good sources or bad sources? What do we mean by reliable sources? Are all sources reliable? Are all sources trustful? Using a simple example, if we look at the Cold War and we read a Soviet source or an American source, will we have the same point of view? Are any of these sources reliable? Can we find a halfway through, a middle point. Same thing happens when we look at the Crusades, for example, or any topic of interest. We will always have people bringing different perspectives. So what can we do to make sure that our students are looking for good information? So I'm going to share with you some methods. And for all the methods, there will be advantages and inconvenience, and it will be up to you to decide, depending on your students, depending on your profile, depending on your subject, which method works for you. The first one is called the Ddab method, and as you can see, the word Ddab stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. You will see that all the methods that I'm going to be talking about have the same input, the same approach to the sources. Some of them bring more depth. Some of them remain more superficial. Some of them are more applicable for grade 6, grade 7 students. Some other ones are for grade 10s, 11, and 12. Yeah, but I think this slide explains perfectly well each one of the points, and I don't have to go through all of them. But basically, when we look at currency, we just need to look at, is it a primary or a secondary source? When was it posted? It's a question of time, basically. And then if we look at the relevance, it's the relation between the source and the topic we're studying, and to what extent that source is needed, is relevant, is important. Yeah. If we look at the authority, it's basically the author, analyzing who's the author. Is it an organization? Is it a single person? Is it a journalist? And what's behind that author? To what extent the author is credible? And looking at the accuracy of the source, it's looking at the origin of the information, and to see to what extent the information is supported, is backed up with evidence. The language used, looking at potential grammar errors that can give us an example of how accurate the source is, isn't it? And finally, looking at the purpose. What's the intention of the information? Is information that is delivered to teach, to entertain, to persuade? So looking at these main aspects. Another method is the one that we call the real method. The real method only works for online sources. Keep it in mind that now with the online learning, pretty much all the students are basing their research on online. That can be very interesting, yeah? And real stands for reading the URL, if it's .edu.org. So depending, if it's edu.org, it can be 1 point. If it's .com, then maybe that's not that point, same word, yeah? Or the E is for examine, the content, the site content, the vocabulary, the sources. Does it have a bibliography? The pictures, the grammar being used, the kind of language, yeah? So, and then we're going to grade that out of 3. The more accurate it is, or the more we think the content is correct, the higher the grade we're going to give for that bit. And A will be for asking about the author, who, since anybody can write on the internet, isn't it? The example is Wikipedia. Anybody can publish in Wikipedia. But who wrote that website? Who's the author of that information? And then depending on who the author is, if we're looking for an historical event, if the author is a professor, is an historian, then we're going to give 2 points. If the author is, well, it depends, isn't it? If it's depending who it is, we can give 1 point or even 0 points if we don't know anything about the author. And finally, the links that appear on the website. Where are they sending us? That's very important to realize, because the websites will only have links depending on how serious the website is. And those links can be to other websites, to other sources, to unnecessary adverts, and we're going to grade that out of 2. If you teach the MYP, you can easily use the criteria, because the 1 + 3 + 2 + 2, that's out of 8. So if your analysis is below 4, means that maybe you shouldn't use that source. So this system is very useful for MYP students, yeah, because it follows the MYP criteria in terms of numbers. Another one is the typical OPVL. When I say typical, this is because it's the one that is being used for paper 1 in history, in diploma. Yeah, OPVL stands for origin, purpose, value, and limitations. And it's similar to the Ddab system, probably more precise, more specific. In terms of origin, is the origin of the source itself. Yeah, when we look at the purpose, is the purpose in which the source has been written. When we look at the value, is how valuable is the source in order to analyze the topic that we're covering. And when we look at the limitations, it's the limitations of the source, of the political sources or reliable sources, primary, secondary, objective, subjective. So this is probably the one that everybody knows. That's a very straightforward method. Another one is the DDAABB method. Okay, so if you can see, and you have the source, there's a T as source. It's very similar to the Opvl and to the CRAB. This one looks at the date, the detail, the author, the audience, the bias, and the backup. And if we look at each one of the points, you will see lots of similarities between the date in this method, yeah, and the origin in the Opvl. It's pretty much the same thing, yeah. So another way of doing it, probably this one is more simplistic. Maybe this one is more adaptable for grade 6 and grade 7 students because it guides them through the process in a more specific and step-by-step way. Another one is the Weinbergs Method, and this one it's based on 4 points. The first one is called sourcing, and this is the one that analyzes the date, probably the moment in which that source was created. It also analyzes the purpose of that source. Then the point 2, which is contextualizing, is, for example, if we look at a source, again looking at World War II, look at the way in which the source was written. Is a primary source written during the context of World War II, or is a secondary source written in 2010 from an author that was not alive during World War II? Something to look at, yeah, primary, secondary. Then number 3 is the close reading, so looking carefully, looking at the word, the images, the aspects, the meanings, the vocabulary, the grammar being used, and that will give us a close idea of how reliable the source is. And finally, the corroboration, which is looking at similarities and differences between this source and others. Yeah, it's a comparison bit. So as you can see, the Weinbergs method has some bits from all the other methods that we've been discussing prior to these. Okay, this is another one, the OEIW, which is standing for Observe, Explain, Infer, and Wonder. And I attached to this slide a typical spreadsheet or a document that can be used for this source analysis. So you can give it to the students and they just need to follow the graph and trying to fill in the boxes, looking at the origin of the source, in observing, explaining the meaning of the source, inferring, looking at the message, the hidden message of the source, and wonder is what questions come up to our mind when we look at it. I hope that you found this session useful. And then please feel free to share with me any question, any clarification that you need. I can tell you the one that I use for my students is the Opvl because I teach history DP, but I have colleagues using other ones and they're very happy with it. So again, thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.